There are moments in life that burn through time itself, moments that split you open and rewrite who you are. For most people, pain fades. For me, it became a vow. I didn't know that day, standing in the rain outside the mansion gates, that the boy who humiliated me would someday choke on his own pride while I decided whether he lived or died. But every storm begins with one flash of lightning, and mine started the moment he laughed. The sky was bruised that afternoon, swollen with thunder and heavy with the smell of wet earth. I remember because I had already been fighting tears before the rain ever came. My mother's hands had mixed the cleaning solution I carried, the only product she could sell to the rich families who treated us like shadows. I walked 2 miles through puddles to deliver it, clutching the box as if it contained our survival. Because in truth it did. The mansion rose in front of me like something alive, enormous and cold, its gates taller than the trees. I stood there for a moment, shoes filled with water, before the guards finally allowed me in. They looked at me with the kind of smirk people reserve for things they step around. Inside, everything glittered. Marble floors, gold light, laughter echoing off the walls. I tried not to stare. Poor girls don't belong in worlds like that. We survive by pretending we don't notice what we'll never own. I found the grand hallway that led to the kitchen, but before I could take 2 steps, my wet shoes slipped. The box flew out of my hands, crashed to the floor, and the liquid splattered in every direction, including across the polished leather shoes of the man who had just entered the room. The laughter began instantly. I looked up. He was tall, sharp-jawed, perfectly dressed, the kind of beauty that makes cruelty look elegant. Adam Calloway. I had seen him once on television, the son of one of the country's richest families. He didn't speak at first. He just looked at me as though I were a stain he couldn't wash off. Then he said, almost lazily, "Do you even belong on this property?" The laughter swelled. My face burned hot while the rest of me felt frozen. I tried to apologize, to explain that I was only delivering his order, but he cut me off with a smirk that could slice through skin. "Here," he said, reaching into his pocket. Coins clattered to the marble floor and rolled toward my knees. "Buy yourself some dignity." Every coin sounded like a slap. I could hear my mother's voice in my head. "Don't ever make a scene in a rich man's house. They'll make you regret it forever." So, I didn't cry. I bent down and picked them up, one by one, my fingers trembling. Each metallic click echoed in the hollow of my chest. His friends whispered and filmed, capturing my shame like entertainment. When I finally walked out, their laughter followed me down the hall, out the door, and into the storm. The rain struck my face, but I barely felt it. My tears mixed with it until I couldn't tell the difference. The box was ruined. My pride was gone. But somewhere beneath the weight of humiliation, something fierce began to breathe. That night, I spread the coins across my table, the same way I would later spread out exam papers and medical charts. I counted them slowly, then whispered to myself, "You'll remember me. Maybe not tomorrow, maybe not next year, but someday, you'll have no choice." I taped one of those coins above my bed. Every morning after that, I looked at it before leaving for work, not as a reminder of my pain, but of the promise I made that day. Years would pass before I saw him again. By then, I would no longer be the girl on the floor, but the woman who stood over others' broken bodies, deciding whether they deserved another chance. And when fate finally brought us face to face again, he wouldn't be the one standing tall. He'd be the one lying helpless beneath the blinding lights of my hospital ward, his life hanging by a thread. They say silence is peaceful, but they've never lived inside the silence of poverty. A silence filled with the hum of unpaid bills, the slow ticking of hunger, and the echo of laughter from people who have already decided you'll never rise. After that day at the mansion, I didn't just carry humiliation. I carried a mission carved into my bones. I wanted to become so extraordinary that even the ones who spat on my name would have to whisper it in awe. The morning after the rain, my mother's hands trembled as she wrapped her bandaged fingers in cloth before heading to work. She didn't ask why my eyes were swollen. She knew the world had been cruel again. I walked beside her, barefoot because my shoes had given up, and I promised myself I never would. Every step to the hospital felt heavier than the last. But that's where my transformation began. Not in classrooms, not in dreams, but on the cold tiles I scrubbed while others healed. When I cleaned those corridors, I memorized everything. The way doctors moved with purpose, the language they spoke that sounded like power, the steady rhythm of heart monitors that became the soundtrack of my ambition. While others saw dirt, I saw destiny. I would pause by supply rooms, reading labels, repeating words until I knew them by heart. Sometimes a nurse would look down at me and say, "You missed a spot," and I would smile, knowing I was already cleaning my way toward her position. At night I studied under corridor lights that flickered as if testing my will. I filled notebooks with borrowed words, diagrams, and notes I copied from textbooks I could never afford. Sleep was a luxury I didn't know anymore. My body ached, but my mind burned brighter than it ever had. Every insult I'd ever swallowed became fuel. Every face that turned away became a reason to keep going. Rejection after rejection arrived like waves determined to drown me. I sent out 50 scholarship applications. 49 came back as polite refusals printed in bold type, words so cold they almost sounded apologetic. I stopped opening the envelopes after a while, until one afternoon, while cleaning a patient's room, I noticed an email notification glowing on the cracked screen of my phone. I hesitated before opening it. I had already learned that hope was dangerous, but when I read the first line, my knees gave out. Congratulations. I read it again and again, my vision blurring with tears. I ran through the hallway, through the rain that had begun again outside, laughing and crying all at once. That night, I showed my mother the letter. She didn't speak for a long time, just held me tight, whispering, "Don't forget where you came from, even when they start to bow." I promised her I wouldn't. The next few weeks blurred into a storm of packing, paperwork, and disbelief. I folded the same uniform I had scrubbed floors in, placed those tarnished coins, the ones he had thrown, into my bag, and kissed my mother's forehead before boarding the bus that would take me to the city. As the wheels turned, I looked out the window and thought of the mansion, the marble, the laughter. I whispered into the wind, "You'll see me again." The bus hummed through miles of night, its windows reflecting a girl no longer broken but forged. The city lights appeared at dawn, vast and merciless, glittering like promises and traps. I pressed my palm against the glass, knowing everything I'd ever wanted waited somewhere within that skyline. What I didn't realize was that the very city I was running toward, the city whose lights I mistook for hope, already belonged to him. Every dream I had was about to lead me straight back into his shadow, into the empire built on the same arrogance that once crushed me. And fate was waiting at the gates, ready to make us collide again. And my hands are the only ones strong enough to hold it. They say healing people makes you feel alive, but no one warns you that saving lives also means carrying their ghosts. The day I first revived a dying patient, I thought I had outrun my past. I believed my strength was unshakable, my heart untouchable. But destiny has a cruel sense of timing. It always waits until you feel safe, before it shows you the face you swore you'd never see again. The first morning of my nursing career smelled like disinfectant and nerves. I pressed my uniform smooth, pinned my name badge straight, and walked through the sliding doors of the hospital that would soon become both my battlefield and my home. Every sound, the rhythmic hiss of oxygen tanks, the steady beeping of monitors, felt like a heartbeat guiding me forward. For years I had cleaned these halls as an invisible worker. Now I walked them as a healer. I learned quickly that nursing isn't just medicine. It's endurance. I held the hands of strangers who were fading away, wiped tears from faces that would never remember my name, and smiled through exhaustion because the alternative was breaking. The ache in my back and the sting in my eyes became proof that I was finally living the life I had fought for. Weeks turned into months. Each shift felt like another victory against the poverty that had tried to cage me. Then one stormy night, as I sipped cold coffee and reviewed a patient chart, the loudspeaker crackled. Code black incoming. Male 29, vehicle collision, multiple fractures, head trauma, ETA is 5 minutes. The words barely registered. Code black was routine chaos. Until I saw the look on the paramedic's face when they rolled the gurney through the emergency doors. Blood slicked his hair, glass shimmered on his clothes, and the smell of gasoline clung to the air. I stepped forward automatically, snapping on gloves, my voice steady. Pulse? Faint but present, someone answered. BP 80/40, dropping fast, shouted another. We worked like clockwork. Suction, IV line, oxygen mask. I leaned over the patient, ready to assess the head wound. And then the world tilted. Even through the bruises, through the blood and swelling, I recognized that face. The angle of his jaw, the faint scar near his lip, burned into my memory since the day he had humiliated me, Adam Calloway. For a moment the room vanished. I couldn't hear the monitors, the voices, the thunder outside. Only the echo of coins hitting marble and laughter that had never stopped ringing in my ears. My hands froze mid-air, my throat locked. Every part of me screamed to step back, to let karma finish what it had started. But my training anchored me. The nurse in me fought the girl I had been. One commanded, save him. The other whispered, let him feel what it's like to beg. BP dropping, someone yelled. The spell shattered. I gritted my teeth, inserted the IV, adjusted the oxygen, and started compressions. My heartbeat pounded in rhythm with the monitor's shrill tone. For 2 endless hours we worked. Blood transfusions, sutures, adrenaline, whispered prayers. When the surgeon finally declared him stable, I stood motionless, drenched in sweat and disbelief. They wheeled him to recovery. I followed silently, chart in hand, unable to look away from the man who had once looked down on me. His face, pale beneath the fluorescent light, seemed almost fragile, human in a way I had never imagined. I should have felt triumph. Instead, I felt nothing but a hollow ache. When my shift ended, I sat alone in the locker room, staring at my reflection. My hands still shook from the adrenaline. I whispered to myself, "You saved him." The words didn't sound like victory. They sounded like the beginning of something I wasn't ready for. That night, as rain battered the hospital windows, I checked his chart one last time. Room 304, the same room where patients sometimes woke too soon, whispering names they shouldn't remember. I turned to leave, but a voice behind me murmured through the half-open door, "Angel." My blood ran cold. He was waking up, and he was calling for me. They say the universe is fair, but it isn't. Sometimes it doesn't hand you revenge on a silver platter. It gives you mercy instead, wrapped in pain so sharp you can barely breathe. As I stood over the man who once shattered my dignity, the monitors beeping like a countdown between life and death, I realized fate had handed me a choice I never wanted to make. Should I let karma finish what it started? Or should I keep him alive and live with the weight of forgiveness? The light in the operating room was blinding, reflecting off the stainless steel like the world's cruelest spotlight. My gloves were slick with his blood, and every beat of his failing pulse echoed through my chest like a drum I couldn't silence. Around me, the team moved with urgency, voices layered in commands and panic. But inside me, a storm was building, louder than the chaos. Adam Calloway lay motionless beneath the bright light, the same man who had once thrown coins at me as if I were something beneath him. His face, half swollen and bloodied, looked nothing like the untouchable boy from that mansion. He looked human now, fragile, almost innocent. And that was the cruelest part of all. "Pressure dropping," the anesthesiologist shouted. "Clamp that vessel," barked the surgeon. "BP 70/30. My hands froze for half a second. Just half. That's all it would take. One moment of hesitation, and he'd be gone. It would be easy, I thought. The monitors would flatline. They'd call time of death, and the world would never know. He'd never wake up, never remember me, never face what he did. For one breath, I let myself imagine it. The silence that would follow, the finality, the strange satisfaction of poetic justice. But then, as my pulse thundered in my ears, another voice rose above it, quieter but stronger. It wasn't the voice of the hurt girl I had been. It was the nurse I had become. "You took an oath." My vision blurred for a moment. Then I exhaled and snapped back into motion. "Suction," I ordered, my tone sharp enough to cut through the panic. I clamped the artery, pressed on the wound, and counted in my head, fighting to bring his numbers up. Minutes bled into hours. We worked through exhaustion and adrenaline until finally, the line on the monitor steadied. The rhythm returned. A weak pulse, but steady. He was alive. The surgeon nodded. "Good work, everyone." The team began to clear, their voices fading into the hum of machinery. But I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the man on the table. My reflection hovered above him in the glass, pale and trembling. I had saved the same man who once looked at me like dirt beneath his shoes. The irony was suffocating. When they wheeled him out to recovery, I followed silently. The echo of my footsteps drowned beneath the soft squeak of the gurney wheels. The hallway smelled of iodine and rain. My hand still shook, but not from fatigue, from disbelief. In the quiet of the recovery ward, I watched him through the glass window. Machines breathed for him, tubes feeding him life, drop by drop. I studied the face that once haunted my nightmares, and I realized something that made my throat tighten. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. Saving him didn't make me weak, it made me free. Because mercy is a power cruelty will never understand. I sat down, exhaustion crashing over me, and let the weight of it settle. Around me, the hospital hummed with life, a symphony of heartbeats and survival. And I wondered if fate was laughing somewhere, amused by the twist it had written. I thought the hardest part was over, that saving him would be enough to bury the past. But later that night, as I walked past his room, I felt his gaze before I even looked up. His eyes were open, confused, searching. And when they found mine, a shiver ran through me. Because for the first time since that mansion night, Adam Calloway was looking directly at me. Some voices echo for years inside your head, especially the ones that once tore you apart. When I first heard his voice again, it didn't carry arrogance or cruelty. It carried weakness, confusion, and a trembling kind of gratitude that frightened me more than his hatred ever did. I had dreamed of the day he would look up at me and realize who I was. I just never imagined that when it finally came, he would call me an angel. The room was soaked in half-light, that pale, sterile glow that always made hospitals feel like they were trapped between night and morning. I was standing beside his bed, adjusting the IV drip, when his eyelids fluttered open. For a heartbeat he stared at the ceiling, lost. Then his eyes found mine, and the weight of years collapsed into a single, unbearable moment. I expected rage, or fear, or the same hollow cruelty I remembered from the mansion steps. Instead, his voice came out fragile, uncertain, almost childlike. "You saved me?" I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. "That's my job," I said, keeping my tone even, though my chest felt like it might split in two. He watched me for a long second, as if my face carried a memory just beyond his reach. Then he smiled, that same slow, practiced smile that used to make girls in town whisper. Only now it looked broken. "Then you're my angel." the words hit me harder than any insult ever could. Angel. It felt like mockery wrapped in sweetness, a word so gentle it burned. I wanted to snap, to remind him that angels don't crawl through mud or bleed for their mother's rent. But instead I nodded and wrote down his vitals, pretending that the tremor in my hands came from exhaustion. He drifted in and out of sleep for hours after that, sometimes mumbling things I couldn't make out. Every time I walked past his bed, his eyes followed me, searching for something he couldn't name. The other nurses joked about how calm he was around me, how he refused painkillers until I was the one to administer them. They thought it was sweet. They didn't know that every moment I spent near him felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, one wrong breath away from falling back into the girl I used to be. By the third day, he was speaking more, asking questions, not about his company, not about the accident, but about me, where I studied, why did I look so tired, whether I believed in fate. I kept my answers short, safe, and professional. But fate has a way of enjoying irony. The more I tried to hide, the more he seemed to see through me. "You seem familiar," he said one afternoon, his gaze steady and searching. I froze for a fraction of a second before forcing a smile. "Maybe I just remind you of someone you used to know." He laughed softly, wincing as pain rippled through his ribs. "If that's true, then she must have been someone who made the world a little quieter just by being in the room." The words were simple, but they cracked something open inside me. For years I had imagined him apologizing, begging, weeping, anything that would let me feel the satisfaction of revenge. But this version of him, fragile and sincere, confused me more than I wanted to admit. I couldn't tell if I hated him for changing or pitied him for being too broken to remember the person he'd once been. That night, I stayed later than my shift required. I told myself it was duty, professionalism, and concern for the patient. But when I stood beside his bed and watched the steady rise and fall of his chest, I realized it was something else entirely. I wanted to understand the man fate had delivered back into my life, like a riddle I wasn't ready to solve. He didn't remember me, not yet. But memory is a cruel tide. It always returns to shore. And as I turned to leave his room, his voice followed me, softer than the heartbeat monitor beside him. "What's your name?" he asked. I paused at the door, my throat tightening. Because the moment I answered, the past would no longer stay buried, and neither of us would be the same again. Some reckonings don't come with thunder or fire. They arrive quietly, like a whisper that crawls beneath your skin and steals your breath. That night, karma didn't come crashing through the door. It came through his dreams. And when he spoke my name in his sleep, my real name, the one I had buried under years of struggle and silence, I felt the past split open, like a wound I thought had healed. The night was heavy, with the scent of rain, the kind that makes the world seem smaller and the air too thick to breathe. The ward had gone still after midnight. Machines hummed their endless lullaby while the storm pressed its fingers against the windows. I was finishing paperwork when I heard it, faint, cracked, and disbelieving. My name. At first I thought I imagined it. The sound had become so rare in my life that hearing it here, from him, felt impossible. I froze, my pen suspended mid-air, as he murmured again, a little louder this time. The syllables trembling through the darkness, breaking the silence like confession. I turned slowly. He was half asleep, his lips moving, his brow furrowed. His body twitched beneath the blanket, caught in dreams that were clearly not kind. My name fell from his mouth once more, this time with a pain that didn't belong to the arrogant boy I remembered. It belonged to a man finally haunted by the memory of who he used to be. For a long time, I stood there, caught between past and present. My heart raced so fast I could hear it echo through my ears. It wasn't just shock, it was fear. Fear of what would happen when morning came and he looked at me not as his savior, but as the shadow of his own cruelty. When dawn broke, the world outside was washed clean, but inside the room, the air felt heavier than ever. I walked in with his medication, determined to pretend nothing had happened. He was awake, his eyes following my every step. I could feel it, that searching gaze, the kind people wear when they're trying to remember a dream they're not sure was real. "Morning," I said, setting the chart at the foot of his bed. He didn't answer right away. His throat worked as if forming words hurt. Then, softly, he whispered, "It's you." My hands tightened around the clipboard. "You should take your medicine," I said, my voice steadier than my heartbeat. He shook his head slowly, disbelief flickering across his face. "You're the girl from the mansion." Silence swallowed the room whole. I could hear the rhythmic beep of the monitor, the faint hum of the fluorescent lights, and the sound of my own breathing. Sharp, uneven, exposed. I didn't confirm it with words. I didn't need to. The truth was already written in the way I refused to meet his eyes. He covered his face with his hands, his voice breaking through his fingers. "I was cruel. I was a monster. I don't even know why you saved me." I wanted to say something sharp, something that would remind him what his laughter had done to me, but all I could manage was, "Because that's what I do." He looked at me then, eyes red and hollow. "You should have let me die." The sentence hit me like a slap. I turned away before he could see the tears gathering in my eyes. "That's not how mercy works," I whispered, mostly to myself. The rest of the day moved in slow motion. I went through the motions of my shift, but every sound, every face, blurred into white noise. All I could see was the memory of his expression, the guilt that had replaced arrogance, the tremor in his voice when he realized what I had done for him. That night, when the hospital lights dimmed again, I sat by the window, watching lightning tear the sky in half. I wondered if forgiveness was ever meant for people like us, those who had bled on each other's scars, those whose lives were chained together by one cruel mistake. I told myself I could handle it, that I would stay professional, detached, untouched. But destiny doesn't care about vows or logic. It cares only for timing. And as the storm outside raged into the night, I didn't know that what had begun as a moment of recognition would soon turn into something far more dangerous, the beginning of a connection that neither of us was prepared to survive. Some people haunt you differently, not like ghosts that fade with dawn, but like living reminders of the choices you never made. After the night he remembered me, the air between us changed. Every word, every silence, carried the weight of something neither of us knew how to face. I wanted to run, to rebuild the distance I had once prayed to cross, but fate doesn't let you walk away from unfinished lessons. The days that followed were unbearable in their quietness. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried the fragile hesitation of a man terrified of breaking what little trust remained. I went through my routines, taking vitals, changing bandages, adjusting his medication. But every time our hands brushed, my resolve cracked a little more. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was something dangerous, understanding. I filed for reassignment 2 days later. My supervisor skimmed the paperwork, frowned, and said, "He asked for you specifically. He trusts you. He won't recover without you." I wanted to tell her that trust was a luxury built on lies, that his healing was scraping old wounds raw for me, but I couldn't find the words. So I just nodded and returned to the ward, the sound of rain outside tapping like a reminder of promises I never made. He was sitting up that day, propped against his pillows, watching the storm through the window. When I entered, he smiled faintly, not the charming smile of a man who owned the world, but the small, tired smile of someone trying to deserve a second chance. "You came back," he said softly. "It's my job," I replied. But the truth was heavier. Sometimes, between doses and dressings, he would talk, not about money or power, but about loneliness. He told me about a father who had loved him through business transactions, about a mother who had left before he learned what kindness was supposed to sound like. He confessed that arrogance had been armor, that cruelty was the only language he had ever learned to keep people from seeing how hollow he truly felt. I didn't pity him, but I understood him in a way that scared me, because when someone shows you their pain, you start to forget your own. I had spent years building a life defined by strength and independence, yet there I was, softening for the very man who had once made me feel small. One evening, after his physical therapy session, he looked up at me with eyes that carried exhaustion and something close to gratitude. "You could have left me to die," he said quietly, "but you didn't." I avoided his gaze, focusing on the bandage I was changing. "You don't need to thank me." "But I do," he insisted. "I've spent years surrounded by people who only cared about what I had, not who I was. You're the first person who looked at me and saw nothing worth taking." His words lodged deep inside me, sharp as glass. I had built my walls high enough to survive humiliation, rejection, and poverty. But kindness, when it comes from the person who once hurt you, can be the most dangerous weapon of all. That night, I walked home through the rain, my thoughts a whirlpool of contradictions. Forgiveness wasn't supposed to look like this. It wasn't supposed to feel like surrender. I told myself I was strong enough to separate duty from emotion, but the truth was, every time I saw him, the girl I used to be looked back at me, asking why I was still there. The storm outside mirrored the one within me. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating puddles that shimmered like mirrors, and for a moment I saw my reflection. A woman torn between past and present, justice and mercy. By the time I reached home, my clothes clung to me, my body trembling, my mind spinning with questions I couldn't answer. What did forgiveness even mean when the person asking for it didn't just want absolution? They wanted connection. I told myself I could keep my distance, that the walls I'd built would protect me. But destiny, it seems, loves to strike when defenses are lowest. And that night, as thunder tore through the sky and alarms blared back at the hospital, I didn't know yet that fate was testing us again. And this time, the storm outside wouldn't be the only one we'd have to survive. Fate doesn't always arrive gently. Sometimes it comes roaring through the sky, tearing everything apart just to show you who you really are. The night the storm hit, I thought it was just another blackout, another shift to survive. I didn't know that within a few hours, thunder would silence every boundary I'd built, lightning would expose truths we both tried to hide, and that the darkness would make us see each other more clearly than we ever had in the light. The day had been long and heavy, the air thick with tension that only hospitals know, the kind that builds from too many lives hanging between one breath and the next. By evening, the sky had turned bruised purple, clouds stacked like walls of war. When the first thunderclap rolled across the city, the windows rattled in their frames. I was in the ICU, updating charts, when the lights flickered once, twice, then vanished. The low hum of electricity died, replaced by the shrill chorus of machines losing power. In an instant, the ward erupted in confusion. Monitors wailed, patients screamed, nurses shouted for emergency lights. The backup generator coughed, sputtered, then failed completely. The world had gone black. "Manual ventilation! Keep the patients breathing!" someone yelled. I grabbed a hand pump and ran toward the nearest bed, my heart hammering louder than the thunder outside. The air was thick with fear, the kind that smells like sweat, metal, and desperation. Somewhere down the corridor, I heard glass shatter. Someone cried out. Then another sound cut through the chaos, a voice I knew too well. "Where are the flashlights?" I turned, and there he was, Adam, out of bed, his hospital gown soaked with rain from the open window he'd forced shut. He was pale, unsteady, but his eyes burned with determination. "You shouldn't be up," I snapped, rushing to steady him. "You're going to reopen your stitches." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that always carried more pain than pride. "You'd do the same," he said simply. Before I could argue, he grabbed a flashlight from a supply cart and started walking through the ward, his hand pressed to his side, where blood already seeped through the bandage. He used the beam to guide terrified patients toward the exits, his voice calm and steady. "It's okay. Stay together. Help is coming." I wanted to be angry, furious even, but all I could feel was a deep, unexpected ache. Watching him move through that darkness, limping and bleeding, felt like watching redemption fight its way out of a grave. We worked side by side that night, barely speaking, our movements wordless and automatic. He handed me supplies. I tied tourniquets. He carried flashlights. I whispered reassurance into shaking hands. Between us, the silence grew louder, filled with everything we weren't ready to say. At one point, lightning lit up the entire ward, bathing the chaos in white. For a heartbeat, our eyes met. His full apology, mine full of confusion. And then it was dark again. The storm outside howled, but the one between us was silent and alive. Hours passed before the power finally returned, flooding the hallways with harsh fluorescent light. The ward was a mess of exhaustion and relief. Doctors cheered softly as machines came back to life. I stood against the wall, drained, my scrubs soaked in sweat and rain. Adam was sitting in a wheelchair now, breathing heavily, his hair plastered to his forehead. When he saw me, he reached out weakly and caught my wrist. His touch startled me, warm, trembling, human. "You saved them," I said quietly. "You shouldn't have been out of bed, but you saved them." He looked up at me, his voice rough but steady. "You saved me first." I tried to pull away, but he didn't let go. His eyes held mine, not with pride or guilt, but with something far more dangerous. Sincerity. The generators hummed back to life, and the lights above us flickered back on. The chaos settled. The storm outside began to fade. But between us, something irreversible had shifted. He squeezed. My hand once before whispering, "You saved me twice now. How do I ever repay that?" And for the first time, I realized I didn't have an answer, because what was growing between us wasn't something either of us could repay. It was something we would both have to survive. They say time heals all wounds, but that's a lie. Time only hides them under new scars until something, or someone, forces you to peel them open. When I received his invitation, my hands trembled. The same mansion that had once spat me out now stood waiting, not as a fortress of humiliation, but as a stage for something I couldn't yet name. Walking through those gates again felt like stepping into the memory of who I used to be, a confrontation with the ghosts I'd spent years trying to bury. Weeks had passed since the night of the storm. He had recovered enough to leave the hospital, though part of me suspected the wounds that mattered most weren't visible. We hadn't spoken much since, just polite exchanges during checkups, the kind that hide everything real behind professionalism. Then one morning, a note arrived at the nurse's station, sealed with his company's insignia, but written in his own hand. "No cameras, no press," it read. "Just dinner. I owe you more than words." I stared at the page for a long time. Every instinct screamed no, but something deeper, quieter, said yes. Not out of curiosity, not out of forgiveness, but because closure demands courage. The night I arrived, the mansion looked almost unreal. The gates, once symbols of exclusion, opened smoothly at my approach. The same iron bars that had once separated power from poverty, now bowing to let me in. The driveway gleamed beneath the moonlight. The fountain whispered in its endless circle, and the air smelled of rain on marble. Each step across that polished floor was an echo of memory. I remembered my mother's voice calling me home, the laughter that chased me down the hall, the sting of humiliation burning my cheeks. My chest tightened as I reached the grand staircase where it had all begun. He was waiting at the end of the hallway, not in a designer suit this time, but in a simple shirt, sleeves rolled, humility where arrogance used to live. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "I almost didn't," I replied, and the honesty in my voice seemed to surprise us both. He gestured toward the dining room. The table, long enough to feed 50 people, held only 2 settings. Between the candles, silver flickered, reflecting faces I barely recognized. His older and tired. Mine, stronger but still carrying the echo of that frightened girl. Dinner passed in hesitant conversation. He asked about my mother, about my work, about how I had found the strength to build the life I wanted. I answered with practiced calm, the way you talk to someone who once broke you but no longer has the power to. When the plates were cleared, he stood. "There's something I need to show you," he said, motioning for me to follow. We walked through the corridor toward the main hall. My pulse quickened with every step. The marble gleamed just as it had that day, cold and merciless. And then he stopped, at the very spot where I had once fallen to my knees, picking up the coins he'd thrown. "This is where I destroyed my humanity," he said softly. "I thought money made me untouchable, but arrogance blinds you to the faces you hurt." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. My breath caught when he opened it. Inside lay those same coins, cleaned and framed beneath glass, shining as if newly minted. "I kept them," he said, his voice breaking, "to remind me of what my pride cost me." For a long moment I couldn't speak. My heart was torn between fury and compassion, between the satisfaction of seeing remorse and the ache of remembering why it was needed. The air felt heavy, with the weight of what couldn't be undone. Then he did something I never expected. He lowered himself to the floor, slowly, painfully, one hand pressed against his chest as if steadying his heartbeat. He wasn't kneeling to propose. He was kneeling to repent. His voice trembled, barely a whisper against the silence of the marble. "I can't change what I did," he said, eyes glistening. "But if forgiveness is beyond me, let me at least spend the rest of my life earning your respect." And as I stood over him, the same way I once had years ago, I realized that fate had finally turned the world upside down, and now it was my choice what to do with it. True repentance doesn't come with grand speeches or tears that fade. It comes with silence, with the sound of a man's pride collapsing under the weight of what he's done. Watching him kneel wasn't satisfying. It was heartbreaking, because the man begging for forgiveness on that marble floor wasn't the same boy who had once thrown coins at me. He was the ghost of his own arrogance, stripped bare by guilt and the desperate need to make things right. He didn't rise right away. He stayed there, on his knees, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on the floor as if searching for the pieces of his humanity he had lost years ago. For a long moment, I couldn't move. The room was filled only with the quiet hum of the chandeliers above us and the faint sound of rain outside, as though even the storm had paused to witness what was unfolding. When he finally looked up, his voice cracked under the weight of honesty. "You didn't deserve what I did," he said. "I've thought about that day every single morning since I remembered it. I can't undo it, but I can make sure no one else ever feels what you felt because of me." There was no defense in his tone, no excuses, just confession, raw and trembling. I wanted to stay angry, to hold on to the bitterness that had protected me for so long, but his words cut through the walls I had spent years building. "You made me feel worthless," I said quietly. "You made me believe that my poverty was my fault, that my existence was a joke." He nodded, tears slipping down his face, but he didn't try to touch me or justify himself. "Then let me spend the rest of my life proving you aren't." Those words hung in the air between us, heavy as truth itself. The following days moved like echoes of something sacred. I returned to the hospital, pretending life had returned to normal, but everywhere I went, I felt the weight of what had happened at that mansion. His apology wasn't a wound. It was a mirror. It forced me to see how much anger I had been living with, how much of my identity had been built around surviving his cruelty. A week later, the headlines appeared. Billionaire launches Hope Foundation for underprivileged girls, inspired by his nurse, Mira Daniels. I read the article twice before it truly sank in. The foundation carried my name. Not his, mine. I stared at the screen, my heart twisting in disbelief. The man who once mocked me for being poor was now pledging millions to educate girls like me. Girls who had been invisible, silenced, and dismissed. The press called it redemption. The public called it transformation. But I didn't know what to call it yet. When I saw him again at the foundation's first event, he stood in front of a crowd of journalists, philanthropists, and scholars. His voice, calm but heavy with emotion, echoed through the hall. "She saved my life," he said, gesturing toward me. "But not just in that hospital. Years before, when she taught me what it means to have a soul, and I ignored her pain. Every step I take now is to make sure no one else repeats the cruelty I once believed was strength." Applause filled the room, loud and reverent. But I stood still, my throat tight, my eyes burning with tears I refused to shed in public. Because part of me wanted to believe him completely, to see this as proof that people could change. But another part whispered that redemption doesn't erase history. It only rewrites the ending. After the event, he approached me quietly, away from the flashing cameras. "You don't owe me your forgiveness," he said, "but I owe you everything. The life I have now, the man I'm trying to become. It started the moment you chose to save me." I looked at him for a long time, trying to find the boy who had once made me feel invisible. But he was gone. In his place stood a man who was learning, one apology at a time, that humility is the only crown worth wearing. That night, as I walked home beneath the soft glow of streetlights, the world felt both heavier and lighter. Forgiveness suddenly seemed closer, yet trust still felt impossibly far. Because change can be performed, but sincerity can only be proven over time. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of his redemption. It was only the beginning of a new test, one that would force me to decide whether I could truly believe in the man who had broken me to build himself anew. Change is a word, too easily spoken, too easily faked. Anyone can say they're sorry. Few can bleed for their apology. I had forgiven people before, but never trusted them again. And trust, real, unshakable trust, can only be tested through sacrifice. So when I looked into Adam's eyes and saw remorse wrapped in promises, I decided words weren't enough. I needed proof. The morning was gray when I called him. I told him to meet me at the old neighborhood. No cameras, no reporters, no foundation banners, just him and me. He didn't ask why. He simply said, "Tell me where to go." By noon, his sleek black car rolled past streets lined with rusted signs and peeling paint. The neighborhood hadn't changed much since I'd left. The same cracked pavements, the same stray dogs wandering near half-collapsed houses, the same small clinic that had once patched me up when life hit too hard. I watched him step out of the car, his polished shoes sinking into the mud. For a moment, I saw hesitation flicker across his face, but then he straightened his shoulders and followed me inside. The clinic smelled of disinfectant and dust. The lights flickered, the walls peeled, and the air buzzed with the quiet chaos of suffering. Children cried softly, while their mothers whispered prayers. A few nurses worked tirelessly, but they were overwhelmed. Adam looked around, silent. I turned to him and said, "You want redemption? Then start here. No speeches, no donations, just work." He didn't hesitate. He took off his watch, rolled up his sleeves, and asked, "What do I do first?" I handed him a bucket and a mop. "Start by cleaning the floor." He nodded, not with pride, but with acceptance, and bent down without another word. The sight of him, a man who once ruled boardrooms, now scrubbing a stained floor with his bare hands, sent a strange ache through me. Around us, people stared, whispering. I didn't stop him. This was the test. Hours passed. He carried boxes of supplies, lifted gurneys, helped elderly patients to their seats. When a child began to cry, terrified of an injection, he knelt and spoke to her softly, showing her how to count the seconds of courage. Later, when one boy's worn-out shoes split open at the seam, Adam didn't think twice. He pulled off his own leather shoes, the kind worth more than that family's monthly income, and slipped them onto the boy's feet. "They'll bring you luck," he said with a tired smile. I watched from the doorway, arms crossed, my heart warring with itself. This wasn't the same man who had once thrown coins at me. This man was different, not performing, not pretending. His hands were filthy, his shirt torn, his voice hoarse from helping. By the time the sun began to set, he was slumped against the wall, sweat dripping down his face. But there was a quiet light in his eyes, the kind that only comes from doing something real. He looked up at me as I approached, his expression unreadable. "You brought me here to see if I'd break, didn't you?" I met his gaze. "I brought you here to see if you'd feel." He smiled faintly, his lips trembling with exhaustion. Then I guess I finally did. For a long moment I couldn't speak. I had spent years believing that people like him didn't change, that cruelty was born in them like a disease. But watching him now, barefoot, dirty, surrounded by the same poverty he once mocked, I realized redemption isn't a speech. It's a surrender. The sky outside burned orange, then faded into violet. I handed him a bottle of water, and he took it with shaking hands. We sat in silence, listening to the hum of the clinic generators and the faint laughter of children whose pain had eased for a while. I thought that was the end of his test, that maybe I could finally let go of the past. But as we stepped outside into the twilight, he turned to me with something new in his eyes. Determination, mixed with fear. "There's one more thing I need to do," he said quietly. "Something I should have done years ago." And in that moment, I realized fate wasn't finished with us yet. It was preparing its final lesson, one that would change both our lives forever. Not every love story begins with laughter. Some are born from the ashes of humiliation, shaped by time, and softened by forgiveness. He didn't need a diamond to propose. He only needed honesty, the kind that bleeds when spoken aloud. When he handed me that folded letter with trembling hands, I realized that sometimes the truest proposals aren't about promises of forever. They're about redemption that never stops trying. It happened a few weeks after the day at the clinic. The city was quiet, wrapped in the hush of spring rain, and I was on my way home when he called. There was a weight in his voice that I hadn't heard before. Not sorrow, not guilt, but something deeper, almost sacred. "Can you meet me?" he asked softly. "Just for a few minutes." When I arrived, he was waiting beneath the same oak tree outside the hospital where our paths had once crossed by accident. No guards, no cameras, no expensive cars. Just him, wearing a simple shirt, his hair damp from the rain, holding something in his hands. He smiled nervously as I approached, the kind of smile that belongs to a man who's found courage only because he's terrified to lose it. "I've written something," he said, offering me a folded letter. I didn't know how to say it without losing my voice. The paper was creased from being held too long, the ink smudged where his fingers had pressed too tightly. I unfolded it carefully, and as I read, my vision blurred with tears I hadn't planned to shed. "You saved my life, twice. Once when my heart stopped, and once when my soul did. I can't erase what I did to you, but I can spend the rest of my life proving that the man who mocked you no longer exists. Let me build something with you, something honest, not to repay a debt, but to live a truth." When I finished reading, I looked up. His eyes were glistening with tears, but he didn't move closer, didn't reach for my hand. He just waited, patient, trembling, vulnerable. "I don't need your forgiveness," he said, "but I need your faith. Let me spend whatever time I have left proving I deserve it." The wind moved through the trees, carrying the smell of rain and earth, and I felt something inside me shift. For years, I'd carried the memory of that humiliation like armor. But forgiveness, real forgiveness, isn't about erasing pain. It's about refusing to let it own you anymore. "I already gave you something more than forgiveness," I said quietly. "I gave you a second chance. What you do with it is up to you." He smiled then, not the confident grin of a billionaire, but the shy, trembling smile of a man reborn. And before I could speak again, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple silver ring. Nothing extravagant, no diamond, no grandeur, just a circle. Endless, unbroken, honest. "I don't have a speech," he said, "just a promise. I'll never stop trying to be worthy of the woman who taught me what love actually means." The proposal wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It was a whisper, a confession, a homecoming. I said yes, not because of what he had become, but because of what I had become in the journey that led us here. We married quietly, in a small garden behind the clinic we had once worked in together. There were no photographers, no headlines, no applause, just the sound of wind through the trees, the laughter of children playing nearby, and the soft music of a life finally finding peace. When he slipped the ring on my finger, I realized love doesn't erase history. It redeems it. It turns every bruise into a story, every scar into a reminder that pain can be the beginning of something beautiful. Sometimes I still wake in the middle of the night and remember that day in the rain. The laughter, the humiliation, the sting of being less than human. But then I turn and see him beside me, asleep, his hand finding mine instinctively, even in dreams. And I understand what fate had been trying to teach me all along. Every night before I close my eyes, I whisper the same words into the dark, not out of sorrow, but gratitude. Some pain doesn't destroy you. It reshapes you. Some enemies become your greatest lessons. And sometimes, the people who once broke you are sent back into your life, not as punishment, but as proof that miracles don't always arrive wearing wings. If this story touched your heart, then don't just scroll away. Hit that subscribe button and become part of this journey where pain turns into power and kindness wins every time. Share this video with someone who still believes redemption is impossible. Remind them miracles can wear human faces. And tell me in the comments, if life gave you a second chance, what would you do differently?